Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Charlottesville. How are you this afternoon? Great. All right. Yes, you can clap. Welcome to the Virginia Festival of the Book and the panel discussion, a hot discussion this afternoon. Questions, expertise, and the president, not just for news junkies. And we would like to thank the city of Charlottesville for providing the venue for today's event, and we want to welcome all of our viewers on C-SPAN and Charlottesville's own TV 10. During the question and answer portion, we ask that you please wait for a microphone to be brought to you so that you may be recorded. So stay tuned. The Q&A is coming up. And I want to introduce our wonderful panel of authors. We are not in Washington. We're in Charlottesville, but these are some of the top reporters and thinkers that really delve into politics. And we've got a panel for you today. I want to start off with our friend Frank Sesno. Frank Sesno is the author of Ask More, The Power of Questions to Open Doors, Uncover Solutions, and Spark Change. He's a former CNN anchor, White House correspondent, and Washington bureau chief, and is now the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. He has interviewed dozens of world leaders, including 5 U.S. presidents, and I believe it might be 6 with this one, right?
Hope springs eternal.
And he's also the creator of Planet Forward. Let's give Frank a big round of applause. Tom Nichols is next. He's the author of The Death of Expertise, a professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College and an adjunct professor at the Harvard Extension School and a former aide in the U.S. Senate. He is also a 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion. 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion. My God.
Not sure I want to be on a panel with him.
I know.
Scary.
I wonder if he won the spelling bee, too. Next, Michael Kranish.
According to my copy editor. His answers will all be in question form.
All right. Michael Kranish is the co-author of Trump Revealed, An American Journey of Ambition, Ego, Money, and Power. He's a political investigative reporter at the Washington Post, and he previously co-authored biographies of Mitt Romney and John Kerry, and is also the author of Flight from Monticello, Thomas Jefferson at War. Let's give him a big round of applause. Michael Kranish. And Marc Fisher is also the co-author of that same book, Trump Revealed. He is a senior editor at the Washington Post and author of Something in the Air, History of Radio and After the Wall on Germany after the Berlin Wall. He received Pulitzer Prizes in 2016, 2014 for reporting on police shootings and government surveillance. And let's give this whole entire panel a round of applause. And of course, these gentlemen are authors, and they're authors of these major books that you see before you, and they are for sale, and you can purchase them after this Q&A session. But we want to start off with each author talking about their book. And before I do that, I forgot to introduce the moderator, April Ryan.
That would be you.
White House correspondent and Washington bureau chief for the American Urban Radio Networks, the author of the latest book, At Mama's Knee, Mothers in Race in Black and White. I've been at the White House for 20 years, covering now 4 presidents. And with that, let's go to Frank Sesno. Talk to us about this great book, Ask More.
Well, the book was born of my experience as a journalist and as an interviewer and asking questions of all sorts and ranges of people. Artists, scientists, and business leaders, and yes, politicians. And the recognition and the realization that we ask entirely differently depending on who we're asking and what we're asking about, what our outcome is. And I wrote this book because I felt that all of us could incorporate into our lives better, sharper, more purposeful questions to become better, more successful, more purposeful partners and spouses and parents and workers and inventors and learners and citizens. I feel going into this that observing the world around us, we are inundated with information. Never before in human history have so many people had so much access to so much information so rapidly. And yet we have what I call drive-by questioning. We Google a question and we get a quick answer and then boom, off we go. And what we need to do, I believe, and what I try to lay out in this book, in all of these cases is pause and question deeply, purposefully, sometimes tough, really tough intent, and then listen. And that's the other part that I write about and that is missing so much of in America today, and I know we're going to get into that. How do we listen? Who do we listen to? What is the intent of our listening? What is the outcome? And so in the book, what I've done is I've created 11 categories of questions. Diagnostic questions, what I call the ground floor of questioning. What's going on here? What's gone wrong? And whether it's your elbow or healthcare in America, we cannot reasonably suggest responses, answers, and prescriptions if we don't yet have the diagnosis to the problem. Strategic questioning, thinking down the line, looking over the horizon. Each of my chapters revolves around a character, and the character for that chapter is Colin Powell. Because Colin Powell had to think strategically for 2 Gulf Wars. In the first Gulf War, he went to the first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, with 8 questions. And he said, Mr. President, only if we can say yes to each of these questions should we go to war. And they included, do we have the support of the American people? Have we examined all nonviolent options? Do we know what our exit strategy is? We went to war to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, and the ground campaign lasted 100 hours. Those questions were not asked in the Second Gulf War, and we're still there. And he said, Powell said in a very revealing moment, you know, I'm left holding the bag, because he knows that his performance at the United Nations and elsewhere was insufficient, and he was not allowed enough voice in asking the questions. Creative questioning, really thinking outside the box. What do we ask ourselves and others to transport ourselves with the use of a series of questions into the future? I want to finish and wrap, because I know everybody wants to talk, and we'll come back to this. And I'll tie my other categories and involve all these different categories of questioning. I won't give them away, because now you have to buy the book and find out.
And we will.
And you will.
Yes.
But as a culture, as a society, in journalism, in media, and beyond, we need to do a better job of asking the right questions of the right people in the right construct over time. In the, fabled follow-up question, I say to my students, questions are like grapes. They come in bunches. You don't ask one and then move on. You're not going to find out what's going on. You guys know, right? Ask any reporter, especially investigative reporter. It's the 4th, 5th, 10th question down where you start to connect. As a culture, as a society, as a body politic, we need to start asking more and asserting less. And we need to understand what goes into the listening that's involved in crossing the divide. I'll close with this. Probably one of my favorite chapters anyway is what I call bridging questions. My character in this chapter is a fellow by the name of Barry Spodak. Barry Spodak was the group therapist for John Hinckley after John Hinckley shot Ronald Reagan. Barry Spodak now advises the FBI, Secret Service, and U.S. Marshals on how to interview, not waterboard, how to interview people who issue threats to determine whether they might actually carry out those threats. Dangerous threat assessment, it's called. His whole methodology of questioning is about bridge building, rapport building, micro-affirmations. Really? I hadn't thought of that before. To draw people out, sometimes who are very angry, alienated, or distressed. There's a lesson in each of these chapters for all of us, but I think that one in the context of today's question will be key. How do we use our questions to build bridges to one another so that we can, a piece at a time, understand those who are very different from us?
Wow, thanks, Frank. Thanks so much. Let's go to Tom about death of expertise.
Well, I'll try and be brief so we can get to your questions as well. But first, I have to start by saying that I don't represent the Navy or the government or Harvard or Charlottesville or anybody but myself. One of the questions I get asked is, why would I write a book with such an obnoxious title and this very challenging, almost in-your-face approach. And it was because I was frustrated. I did not start this book, actually was not born in anything about the election. I started writing something related to it years ago, and I found that I was trying to figure out how have we gotten to this point where ignorance is not only common, but it's prized. It's a virtue. It's something people brag about. That, I don't know how big the U.S. budget is, and that makes me a better person somehow. The first hint I had this was happening is I noticed that people went from talking to experts skeptically, right? No one ever, I certainly don't ever advise people, if your doctor walks in with a big needle, just say, go ahead, wherever you think, I don't know what it is, hit me up. Of course not. I want people to be informed. I want them to ask questions, good questions. I want them to be, participants in their own health, their society, whatever it is. This was born out of more than skepticism about expertise. This was people starting to lecture back to experts as though they were peers, which I found really remarkable. And the word I used throughout the book that has caused some controversy is that I said this is part of an epidemic of narcissism in our society that is really out of control. Now, my background is primarily in Russia studies. I know I am deceptively youthful looking, but I actually got my career started during the Cold War, and I was a Russian-speaking Kremlin guy. That's what I did for a good part of my professional and academic career. And, I was used to people saying, well, you guys are going to screw up the world, blow up the planet. I understood that. In later years, what I found, people would say to me, you're a Russia expert? Let me explain Russia to you. I'm willing to bet everybody here has had, you're a journalist? I have a few things to tell you about journalism. Oh, well, please, let my 30 years of experience just go to the side. If you have a thought, I certainly wouldn't want to interrupt it. And I started to ask the question, why is this happening? Why do people think they're the peers of experts and experienced professionals? Why do they seem to prize ignorance? Why do they respond to facts with nonsense? And I'm sure we'll get into the notion of fake news. Why do they respond to facts with fantasies? And I think, in the end, and this I think is where it dovetails back into the kind of thing we're going to talk about today, Americans have become a people that simply don't want to be told anything they don't want to hear. They want to be they don't want to be educated. They want to be affirmed, and they want to have somebody to blame. They want to know that things are never their fault and that everything has a magical solution. And experts are always the people who walk in and tell you that none of that is possible, which makes us the least popular person at the party every time. But I decided to delve into it, and we can talk about it more later, but I do identify some culprits. I think that I'm uncomfortable saying this so close to a university, but I think the modern university bears its share of the blame. The media bears some of the blame. Certainly the presence of the internet, the galactic answer machine that's usually wrong, bears some of the blame. But we're here now. This is the situation we're in, and I don't know that I have a good answer, but in this book I've tried to identify the problem at the very best. So,
thanks, Tom. Michael, Trump revealed.
Thank you. It's great to be back in Charlottesville. As April mentioned, I was here some years ago working on a book about Thomas Jefferson, a very contradictory character in our history and a fascinating one indeed, so it's always great to return to Charlottesville. Throughout my career, I've spent a lot of time covering the White House and Congress, and it's always striking that a lot of people think what you do in Washington is you go to press conferences, you write down what they say, and you write a story. And I did spend 4 years covering the White House, so you have my sympathies, April, and what you have to do.
I'm 20 in, yes.
And April is a very good example of someone who tries to dig beyond what the spokesperson is saying. My interest for a long time has been, what does a candidate's life say about and predict, perhaps, what that person would do if they are elected to higher office, particularly the presidency. As April mentioned, I was the co-author at the Boston Globe of biographies of John Kerry and Mitt Romney, and in both those cases, a lot of what we had been printing ourselves at the Globe turned out to be not the case. And I had an editor there at the Globe who happens to be the Post's editor now, Marty Barron, and his assignment to me for John Kerry some years ago was just start over. We've written all these stories for years and years and years. Just read those and then start over and leave nothing on the table, which sounds daunting, but to me was a great assignment because, number one, it meant I had a lot of time to start looking into him. And long story short about John Kerry, not here to talk about him, but I wanted to explain why I'm interested in writing biographies of presidential candidates. We had written at the Globe incorrectly that his ancestry was Irish and that he was Irish Catholic. Turned out none of that was true. His family was Jewish. The family name was Cohn. They'd never lived in Ireland. They had simply, when they wanted to change their name from Cohn to something that didn't sound so Jewish, they dropped a pencil on the map, came up in the County Kerry in Ireland, and they said, okay, Kerry is the family name. Kerry himself did not know a lot of this story, and I have every reason to think, having spent a lot of time researching this, that he did have some suspicions on one side of the family but knew nothing about this side of the family, including the fact that his grandfather had committed suicide in the bathroom at the Copley Plaza Hotel, where Kerry himself had spoken for many years. So there's a lot in there that tells us, okay, this is a little bit more complex character. What's the family history? What does that tell us about him and his own curiosity about his family background? In the case of Mitt Romney, when I approached the Romney campaign and told them we want to do the same thing for Romney and write about Mitt Romney's background and career, his spokesperson said to me, I'll never forget this, is why would you want to write a book about Mitt Romney? He's already written 2 books about himself. In the back of one of those books, there was a 59-point plan, not 60 points, but 59 points about what he wanted to do for this country. But if you read those books, they really tell you almost nothing about who Mitt Romney really is or what actually happened in his career. For example, at Bain Capital, the short story was that he was a great runner of companies. Everything was wonderful. Of course, the more complex story is that the only company he ran was Bain Capital itself, which was very profitable, but he didn't run other companies, and there's a very complex history of what happened with each company that he invested in, not ran, actually. Now, when it came to Donald Trump, we had a much shorter time frame. But really, it was the same thing. The narrative that Donald Trump tells about himself is pretty simplistic. He's been an incredible deal maker. He's been very successful. No one's been as successful as Donald Trump has been, and therefore he would be a great president. What we wanted to do was to find out what actually happened. The only way to do that is to go step by step, and so we used a team of reporters in a very short period of time to try to understand what happened. I want to tell you one example and then move on so we can take questions. Let Mark Toss to tell you about some of the genesis of writing the book as well. And that is one of the really surprising things that we found in the book is we all knew that he had troubles in his career financially. The reality is that in the campaign he didn't talk about his failures, but the failures in a lot of ways are more illuminating. Corporate bankruptcies, 6 corporate bankruptcies. He created one public company, and that was with the stock ticker of DJT, his initials. That company had a share price of $35 a share, went down to 17 cents. He made tens of millions of dollars. Shareholders, not so much. So there were shareholder lawsuits. What does that tell us? Well, if you look at what happened yesterday on healthcare, people who supported him would say, how could this have happened? He's the great deal maker. If you read the book, you'll see in several chapters that he wasn't so great sometimes. He was successful. He was able to come back. But the reality is that it's far more complicated. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to make sure at the end of the day, if someone was really interested in who Donald Trump was, there are thousands of stories written in the Post, but those may capture all sorts of things. Here in one hopefully readable, compelling narrative, you get the full story. If whatever you think of Donald Trump, love him or hate him, you'll have a better understanding, we hope, of understanding what he did in his career, what was successful, what was not successful, and how that will educate us about what he does today. So for me, I'm often asked, has it been surprising how he's performed as president? I always say, no, it really hasn't surprised me in the slightest, because he really is acting as he did as a business person. The problem for him so far has been that's not necessarily applicable to being president, even if you have a Republican-controlled Congress, because that party itself is at odds, which is, in the first place, why he got elected, because the party was torn apart, enabled him to defeat other nominees who might have been the party powerful favorite, but obviously there's a lot more to it than that. So in writing the book, I think we were able to tell a fuller story that gives you some sense about what he was like as a business person and how he's performing now as president.
And let's go to Mark. Mark, the co-author of Trump Revealed.
Well, Michael gave you a sense of our mission, which was to find the complexities in Donald Trump's life. As you might imagine, that was not really a concept Donald Trump was terribly much into. The etymology of this book, we had done a number of books through the years on presidential candidates at the Washington Post, and in most cycles, we had a good sense a year and a half in advance of who the candidates would likely be, and so we could set people off to begin delving into the lives of the candidate. As you recall from last spring, this was not entirely clear, and so mid-March rolled around, and we'd said, well, we want to do a book, but we don't know who the candidate's going to be. So at that point, the Republican choice seemed to be down to Trump and Ted Cruz, and we thought, well, let's just go with Trump and see what happens. So we made a deal with the publisher and on a Thursday, and I called Hope Hicks, Donald Trump's press secretary, on Friday to let her know that the following Monday we would be announcing that we were doing this book. And so as a courtesy, I called her up Friday, and I said, we're doing this biography of Mr. Trump, and we would love to come spend as much time as we can with him to talk about his life. And before I could get the whole explanation of the book out, she said, "You are profiteering off Mr. Trump. We will not be cooperating with this book." And I said, excuse me, this is a guy who spends virtually all of his waking hours involved with media in one way or another, whether it's watching cable news or talking to reporters or calling reporters out of the blue.
Or on Twitter.
Yeah, right. And she said, "Yep, we're not taking part in this." And so we thought that might well happen, and we had a plan for reporting the book around him and researching his life and so on. Well, lo and behold, Monday morning came around, and the first call I got was from Hope Hicks. And she said, "I told Mr. Trump about your fabulous idea, and he would love to see you come up to Trump Tower as often as you'd like. He thought it was a great idea. Come on up." And so one revelation from that is that Hope Hicks didn't terribly well know the man she was working for. And the other one is, of course, this tells us something about Donald Trump, and that is that if you're willing to write about him, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, he will be there. And that proved to be the case. He was incredibly gracious with his time. He gave us more than 25 hours of interviews over the course of the 3 months that we were reporting the book. Because we had such a short time to do the book, there was no way that two people could do justice to a person's life in that amount of time. So we put 25 reporters on the book, and we 3 or 4 reporters on each chapter. So we had reporters who went to, say, Atlantic City for 6 weeks and just spent 6 weeks diving into the casino gambling records there, the Casino Control Commission. And similarly, throughout, we sent reporters to his ancestral hometowns in Germany and Scotland. We sent reporters to the foreign capitals where he had business projects in Kazakhstan, in Panama, all around the world, and so on through the course of the book. But the core of the book really, in some ways, is those conversations with Trump, where we learned, as Michael said, the sort of main themes of the book, which are really, I think, a good guide to what we're now seeing unfold every day, because he is nothing but consistent. He's provocative. He will do whatever it takes to get on front pages and at the top of broadcasts, but the patterns of his life are incredibly predictable, particularly in the way he deals with the press. So you see him every day bashing the press. We're the enemy of the people. We're the opposition party and all of that. And then yesterday at 3:30, Congress was supposed to take the vote on the health care bill. At 3:31, Donald Trump called Bob Costa, one of our White House reporters at the Post, on his cell phone. Bob picks up the phone, says blocked number, and he thinks it's an angry reader. One of you, maybe. I don't know. And he picks it up, he answers it, and no, it's the President of the United States, who had nothing better to do at 3:31 than call a reporter to spin the story his way and say this is all the Democrats' fault. And so he's the master marketer. He's thinking marketing first. He's thinking about the Trump show. How do I get people to come back for the next episode of the show? That's top of mind always.
Wow. Wow. Questions, expertise, and the president, not just for news junkies. Well, that was newsy. That was really newsy. I'm serious. That was news. We just got some news from these two gentlemen. Now, I want to focus in on history from yesterday. You talked about yesterday. It was historic. 64 days in, I believe, his first major loss. Who is Donald Trump today after what happened yesterday? The fact that the Republicans, Paul Ryan, had to pull back and not vote on Trump Care, the repeal in the place of Obamacare, better known, or the official title, the Affordable Care Act. Who is Donald Trump? Who do you see him as today?
He's the same guy he was for the previous 50 years. He's the guy who, when things go well, all credit goes to Donald Trump. When things go poorly, he will find out who that person to blame is, and he will destroy them. And so his immediate instinct was, let's blame the Democrats publicly. Privately, he's sending out another message. As the people around him in the White House were discussing how do we deal with this loss, they were talking about, we're going to blame Paul Ryan. And so both of those stories went out simultaneously. So you had anonymously sourced stories about this is all Paul's fault, and you had the straight dope from the president himself saying this is the Democrats' fault. Either way is fine with him because it's deflecting the attention from Trump himself. You know, he was not involved in the actual policy making here. He probably didn't know the bill any better than any one of us knew it. But he knew the messaging that he wanted, and he knew that he was never terribly interested in the health care bill to begin with, and he wanted to do tax reform first. And so he's now able to say to the people around him, told you so.
But Michael, for a man who does not like to admit failure, this was not a winning picture for him.
Well, yeah, obviously he hates the picture, and not only did he lose on health care, but his image has been shattered, because he's a person who has built his whole reputation on the idea that he's a great deal maker, that he can get things done, bring the parties together. And here he issued an ultimatum. He said there's going to be a vote. He wasn't going to back down. This was it. There's no plan B, his press secretary said, presumably at Trump's instruction. And then at the last second, he pulled the bill. In other words, he blinked. And when you blink in Washington, people look at you the next time a little differently. They know that you're going to back down. You don't have the same power. So really, at the start, he had his travel ban overturned by the courts. He attacked the judges, but that's where we are. And on health care, he lost and he blinked. And I think the latter, in the end, could be the more damaging. He could come back with some other health care plan. He could have said, okay, I've heard the voices, I'm a reasonable person, I want to come up with something else. Instead, he cast blame, as Mark said, in his classic Trump style, and sort of backed himself in a corner. He said the Democrats will have to come to me when Obamacare further explodes and so forth. But the reality is that he needs to reach out. He's the president. He's the leader of his party. His own party is basically torn apart over this issue. And this was a signature issue for the party and for himself. So just sitting and waiting is not the kind of thing an effective president usually does. You want to be out there. You want to be proactive.
So, Frank, today, President Trump is on the golf course here in Virginia, supposedly having meetings. And, all right now. And, no, seriously, because, he complained about then President Obama always on the golf course, and now he's on the golf course, and they're making it clear that he's having meetings. So, with that, what are the questions for us? What should journalists be asking today as he's now moving the ball to tax reform and infrastructure efforts that still have yet to have a price tag on them?
Well, let me get to the future in a second, but I'd like to comment on the present for just a moment and actually disagree with Mark just a tiny little bit. I don't think Donald Trump is today the man that Donald Trump was yesterday. I think he's the damaged president today in ways that he wasn't. This is a very substantial defeat. And in politics, as we know, and certainly from my many years covering White House and Washington, perception matters. Momentum matters. Your ability to pull people in the room and craft the deal by cajoling, trading, doing the business of politics matters. Ronald Reagan used to tell the story and that before he launched health care, he brought Danny Rostenkowski into the Oval Office with him, and the two of them had a meeting. And Rostenkowski was the very powerful Democrat chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. And Rostenkowski said to Reagan, he said, look, we both want tax reform, so we're going to work on this together. But I'm going to have to say some things publicly, Mr. President, is going to distance me from you. But I got to play to my base. But I'm going to ask you not to attack me, just to keep quiet for that while I do that. If you can do that, we can get this through together. And Reagan said, well, sure.
You do that very well.
While he was hanging around with the Kremlin types, I was, and they shook hands, and they did a deal. Now, who will shake hands with Donald Trump, and will they be confident that he can deliver and bring these together? So to the questions, did Donald Trump, great leaders ask great questions. And great leaders solicit questions from people who don't agree with them to break groupthink. Did he ask, who is the Republican Party? Did he ask, what does the Freedom Caucus really want? Did he ask, what are the moderates going to insist on? Did he ask, what is the American Hospital Association going to say? Did he ask, what are doctors out there saying? Did he ask, what are Americans going to hear, especially those who voted for me, when this unfolds? I'm not sure he asked those things. So going forward, the questions are, who is your coalition? How are you going to put it together? What are the pieces of this? Are you going to invite the experts in? I mean, last night it was fascinating. Joe Stiglitz said, you know, President Trump wants a chairman of the Council on Economic Advisors who's not an economist. Okay. I mean, this stuff's really complicated, so you got to ask a lot of questions and educate yourself and understand this at the nuance level. And that's, I think, what we should be watching as journalists and as citizens. Who is he asking? What is he asking? What lessons have been learned from this, and how does this get put together to move forward?
Wow.
He doesn't ask questions, though.
He doesn't.
He doesn't ask questions, and he likes to have people around him who don't require him to ask questions or don't solicit questions in any way. And you know, he believes strongly that you never look back, that everything is in the moment, there is no past tense, no regrets, no defeats. So, yes, there are people out there who may see him in a different way now, but there is, what he understands is that his core, his base, they don't see him in any different way now, and the people who were against him, they were against him.
But he's not campaigning now, he's governing, and so that's the difference.
Okay, well.
Maybe, but his title is president.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
His title is president.
And that is a very key point, and you brought up something that leads into Tom about expertise. He is president. He's the president of the United States, and he has many people around him who do not have experience in governance or an experience in certain areas that they are overseeing. With that, Tom, when you talk about the death of expertise, how dangerous is that for the democracy, for the nation, and also, and I want to go into the media as well, because we are now seeing the line obscured more so now than ever between fact and opinion. And that, I believe, is where some of this fake news comes in. I mean, there are other ways of fake news, but we don't know now if it's fact versus opinion. So talk to me about those issues.
Well, let's remember, the president ran against experts. He said at one point during his campaign, he said, the experts are terrible. Who needs experts? Would it be so bad what if I didn't have experts? Would it be so bad? Well, okay, we're in the process of answering that question in real time right now. I think the president in his campaign tapped into this notion with a lot of ordinary Americans that their problems, whatever those problems are, that their dog is sick, their kid is living in the basement, their car broke down, whatever it is, some expert somewhere created this world that is harming them, and that he was going to put them all in their place. And he was going to come to Washington, and he was going to tell these experts what's what, and he was going to tell them all to sit down and shut up. That's why he doesn't need an economist. The only experts, interestingly enough, that he does seem to want to surround himself with are former military guys. He seems to have a real attraction, which, is fun. If he wanted General Mattis as Secretary of Defense and H.R. McMaster as National Security Advisor, that's fine by me. That made me sleep a little easier, to be honest. But this leading this charge from the White House against expertise is really just playing down to people's worst instincts, I would say, about almost everything. About, again, this kind of overwhelming narcissism that says, don't worry, running a government, it's not that hard. Anybody can do this, right? It doesn't. All these guys that are in Washington, they're just getting fat off your tax money. They don't really know any more than you do. And this is a really pernicious notion that somehow you don't need these guys. And I think that's already kind of blowing up, in the White House's face, because again, I think Mark's absolutely right. What was in the bill? I don't think anybody else knew. They said, well, okay, Paul Ryan's he's going to wave his hands and something's going to happen and there's a bill and I'll get the credit for it. But you can't actually run a functional government that way. So I think this is incredibly dangerous because we're not actually a democracy. We're a republic. And a republic requires people to defer to elected representatives and their advisors. I was one of those guys. I was a staff guy. I was personal staff to a senator. And they have to make decisions all day long on everything they do. Anybody who's ever, of course, people here know this, anybody who's worked with a politician, they do childcare in the morning, they do nuclear weapons over lunch, they do environmental policy by dinner time. They have to have experts giving their best advice. And when the people en masse say, don't listen to those guys, let's just do everything by a kind of populist referendum, then you get outcomes like the one we're seeing now, where people said, I hate Obamacare, but I really like that Affordable Care Act.
And that happened in Appalachia, am I correct? That happened in Appalachia, where people did not understand that Obamacare was ACA, and that's how...
But it's happening everywhere. I mean, you're also seeing people across the country. One of the things I open the book with is people a couple of years ago were asked, what should we do about Ukraine? And people had, it's again, not just people saying, oh gosh, I'm really worried about that. People had really strong opinions. Here are that we should engage in military intervention, which, of course, courts the possibility of World War III. And they said, we have very strong opinions about Ukraine. Then you ask them, where is Ukraine?
Oh.
The average respondent, I'll just finish with this. The average respondent, was, when asked to identify Ukraine on a map, was off by an average response of 1,800 miles, which means people couldn't even put it on the right continent.
Could I comment too, Tom, on something else? Because it seems to me that expertise comes in a lot of shapes and sizes, and I think this is one of the very interesting challenges that we confront in thinking about our democracy now and the situation that we've got with the Trump administration. Expertise is also about getting out and living and learning and listening to real people. It's not just the experts from the top, it's also the experts who are living. And one wonders how much, well, I remember when I interviewed Reagan a million years ago, his complaint about being President of the United States was that he felt like the bird in the gilded cage. He couldn't get out. He couldn't talk to people much. And so he sort of intuited things. I think Donald Trump has been a bird in a gilded cage for quite some time, in Trump Tower and various things. And it'd be interesting, how much intuitive knowledge from the experts who were living with healthcare did he bring to this? Has he talked to people, really sat down and talked to people who have a disabled daughter and a single-family parent and are trying to figure out where the health care is going to come from, so that he could relate to the question about Medicaid other than on a sort of soundbite level, which we in the media feed?
Well, he's been the man in the tower for decades, and he because he was a celebrity for so long, we have this sense of him as someone who was out at the clubs in the 70s and 80s, and he was always calling gossip columnists and saying, "Come see Donald Trump. He'll be with Madonna tonight at Studio 54." So he built this image of himself as a social being. He is actually quite a solitary figure, and we went back and went through all the old gossip pages from 1970s and 80s and called all the women who had been associated publicly with Donald Trump in some romantic fashion and said, well, what really happened in those instances? And almost to a person, they said, as soon as the cameras were turned off, he had no further interest. He wanted to go home and watch TV all night by himself. And that is a theme throughout Donald Trump's life. He chooses to be alone. You see him now in the White House. Already we have these stories of him wandering the White House in the middle of the night by himself.
In a bathrobe.
Yeah. which
no, we had that day before
Thanks for sharing that.
It's presidential. As a White House correspondent, you cover all things presidential. That's part of it.
Right. But he is someone who really has not reached out and wanted to learn much about the people around him. And we're seeing it in the way he runs the government. His business, although we think of it as this big sprawling empire, it was a handful of executives up on the 26th floor of the Trump Tower. He never had more than 6 or 7 people around him. And so this is an entirely new experience for him running anything larger.
Can I just make a point? I know we need to get to questions, but I just want to make a point that in some ways Donald Trump is actually very typical of the people who elected him, as well as many other Americans. Part of the reason experts have been pulling back from the public space is because they are finding it impossible to reason with people who believe things that are flatly wrong. To say, for example, well, let's talk about electoral reform. A lot of people don't like the Electoral College or whatever it is. And you sit down with somebody and says, well, what are you going to do about the fact that 3 million people voted illegally? You say, well, that didn't happen. They say, you're calling me stupid and I hate you. No, I'm just saying it didn't happen. It's wrong. I mean, here, gravity exists. The sky is blue. There are clouds.
Voter fraud.
There are
You're
things we
speaking of
can't
voter
argue
fraud.
about.
You're speaking of the voter fraud that he's talking about.
Well, and right, the argument of that, and they don't want those answers. I don't think the president is interested in a dialogue about those answers. The people who you argue with about those questions are not interested in the answers, and as a result, the experts have stepped back and said, okay, then we don't have to have this argument anymore, and they end up just talking to each other.
But Mike, and I want everyone who's ready for questions to raise your hand, because we're getting ready to go to questions. I see some hands going up. Michael, but when you think of Donald Trump, he is a businessman. He ran an empire. He's a mogul. Wouldn't you think, just common sense, this is not analytical or anything, this is just common sense, wouldn't you think, being a businessman, he understood the idea of health care for his employees?
Well, there weren't that many employees. I mean, a lot of the businesses he has
I mean,
today
at
are
casinos,
branded.
he had a lot of people at the casinos, correct?
Right. He had in his business career a lot of success and a lot of failure, like I said before. For Donald Trump, he is looking out, and as a business person, for himself. I asked him the question about the fact that a lot of people were hurt. There were bondholders, there were stockholders, there were contractors. And he said, well, when I was running a business, it was all about basically me. It was making sure that I could survive. And so talking about narcissism, and he has...
He said that
he
was
has
a
said...
quote, it was about
There's
me.
a quote in the book, basically it's about himself. That was his survival. If I'm president, he said, it'll be about all of the people. And he talks about the power of narcissism. He cites a particular book. I'm not sure if he read the book, but he cites a book about the power of narcissism. And I interviewed the author of that book, who was surprised that Donald Trump cited it. But that author said, look, there are some people who are narcissists who can handle it very well, because their narcissism is about all focused on other people. Other narcissists are all focused on themselves. The connecting tissue here is that they're just so focused one way or the other. For Donald Trump, as a business person, if he had to do this to get people out of his way, that's what he did. And that is a defining characteristic. He said he will be different as president, that he will look out for everyone, and he campaigned that way, and it was very, very effective. You got to give him credit. He was at single digits in the polls when he announced, and he convinced a lot of people that he would look out for them. And that's one of the things that he faces right now with health care. He did say, look, I'm going to protect Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, and those are democratic values that are rock solid with the Democratic Party, and a lot of Republicans as well. But he was trying to say, look, I'm looking out for you, and he faces a sort of far right Republican caucus, and they don't agree with some of those factors. So Trump feels himself hemmed in to some degree as a result.
Wow, isn't this a fascinating conversation? Woo, I'm learning stuff just sitting here. I mean, I sit in front of him every day almost, and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm learning more here.
Well, you got to get out a little bit more.
In beautiful Charlottesville, yes. Yes, our first question, yes.
Well, first, thank you so much for being here. It's been a very interesting discussion. I'm interested in the role of blogs in the shaping the media landscape for the last 15 years. And I was hoping each of you could speak to whether that's helped or harmed the news industry and how that interplays with expertise.
Frank?
Well, helping or harming the news industry, we'll have to get a bunch of authors to come back and have a really long conversation, because there's a lot that's harmed the news industry, everything from the collapse of classified ads, which were the backbone of print revenue for so long, to the rise of cable television, my alma mater, where I come from, and certainly blogs, and even more importantly, social media. I think that what we've got out there now is, and this actually gets to some of what Tom was talking about, just so much information. And the power has shifted, really, from the executive editor and the executive producer to the news consumer in many ways. And we don't talk much about that because we want to beat ourselves up, and we should. There's a lot that's really broken in the media right now. The issue with blogs per se, they're very, very successful. I mean, there are many, there are thousands and thousands of them. The issue is, who is it? Again, it's, in my book, I asked all my characters, what is your favorite question? And I've been asked this myself, and I've decided the environment in which we live, my favorite question now is simply this: how do you know? How do you know? And so to bloggers, who is it? Where do they come from? How knowledgeable are they? Is it a rant and a rave, or is it a blog that is built on expertise? Can you tell based on the credentials that this is expertise? Basically, my feeling is in the world in which we live, let 1,000 flowers bloom. The more voices, the better. But then that makes your life, our lives as news consumers, a lot more complicated, because how do we tell the flowers from the weeds? Because plenty of weeds bloom. And so I think that's my off-the-cuff response to you. I think that, so my concern, for example, when Ted Turner put CNN on the air, the skeptics said, this will never work. There is not enough audience or news to power a 24-hour news channel. They may have been right. Because if you watch the cable news channels, the plural, there is actually a lot of talk radio on cable news.
Well, a little uncomfortable for me to say, because the first version of whatever I wrote about expertise was on my blog, but I did it like as therapy. I'd been arguing with somebody who was, explaining Russia to me, and I sat down and I sort of, did this kind of primal scream into my blog. But I'm going to say, with that said, and with the experience of blogs over the past decade, I'm not a fan, and I'll tell you why. My students often will come across my blog, which is going, actually I think it goes dark today. It's after 6 years. I decided it was enough, and now I write for edited stuff because editors are better than that. And somebody said, my students would always say, can we cite your blog? And I'd say, don't cite that. The editor's an idiot. That guy will publish anything. There's no editorial control over that thing. There are two things in particular I worry about with blogs. First of all, it convinces everybody who has one that their thoughts are just so important. And it encourages this notion that, I have a big thought and I have to share it with the world. You know what, folks? It's okay to have thoughts you don't express. And if you feel the need to express them, or you want to talk back to yourself, or practice your writing, that's why God invented diaries. And they're not supposed to be public. The other problem with them...
Till you die.
Well, yeah. The other problem with them is that, and I cite, I did a chapter on journalism, which was kind of an expert violation. For those of you Star Trek nerds, I did violate the prime directive here of kind of writing about something that wasn't my field. But I talked with journalists and I asked them about their own profession. And as one of them, I can't say who it was, but who said to me in interviewing him, he said, younger journalists coming to this field do not understand that blogging is not journalism. They are not the same thing. Blogging is you sitting around thinking stuff. Journalism is the kind of stuff Frank's talking about very structured inquiry questions and so on. And the real fruit of this, if you want, we've been here talking about Trump and kind of the collapse of expertise here. But let's remember that it wasn't that long ago, in the last days of the Obama administration, that Ben Rhodes quite happily said, you know what, and this is practically a quote, he said, the average journalist we deal with is 27 years old and doesn't know anything. Well, that's I would argue, that comes from too much blogging, too much talking, and not enough reading. Too much blogging, not enough experiencing. And so, blogs can be interesting, especially if they're tailored to something, or if they're a particular form of expertise where you're, this is my blog about engine blocks or aviation or whatever it is to other hobbyists. But the idea that everybody in America should sit down and say, I have a really important thought, I think has turned into something bad.
Michael?
Well, I don't want to generalize and say blogs are good or blogs are bad. It really depends on who the person is and what they're writing. So I'm sure there have been many times when I've learned things because someone directed me to something that I haven't thought of, and that's what I want to know. I want someone to challenge I don't have a viewpoint as a journalist. I'm an objective reporter, but maybe I just wasn't thinking about something in a way that will enlighten me, and I think that's extremely important. There's a new motto that the Washington Post has recently started running under the masthead, and it's "Democracy dies in darkness," which the New York Times editor said sounds like a Batman sequel. But it's gotten a lot of people talking, and the point here is that, if I can just say something in defense of the industry, is that yes, there's blogs. I am personally bored by, let's read the column on the left and the column on the right because I know what they're going to say. I want to, and I find it hard to tune into channels that are so pre-formatted. I really want to be challenged with hopefully an interesting discussion that makes me think, and obviously that's what a president should do too as well, should be constantly challenged in his or her thinking about what's going on in the world. So our publication, one of the things that's so heartening to me, and a lot of people are down on the industry, is that time and again I do hear from readers of the book and of the newspaper, thank you for what the Post is doing. thank you for what journalists are doing. Thank you for what the Times is doing. There are a lot of people, especially after the election, who say, we really do need journalism. We want to support you. Our subscription base, as the Times and other places, has actually gone dramatically up because there are people who are realizing, we're concerned that without an independent newspaper that we're not going to get the information we need. So there are plenty of people that, yes, it's true, they want to get affirmation. There's millions and millions of people who want to get information, and they want to get it from a source that's not biased and that they trust. And so every day that we go to work, we know that our currency is not the dollars that are being paid for subscription, but it's trust and the trust that we earn. And we really feel that's important and try to make that our mission, that we provide you with information that you can put faith in, that's not biased. Yes, there's plenty of opinion people who are great, but the main thing we do, obviously, the majority of the work is reporting. And that's something that, fortunately, the Post and a lot of other institutions are still doing, and we thank you for supporting that.
So I think President Donald Trump is not possible without blogs and social media because the way we go about getting information has shifted so dramatically. The majority of the people who come to read stories in the Washington Post come through Facebook, great majority. And they're not reading the Washington Post. They're reading individual stories that their friend recommended to them, and they often don't even know where they've landed. When we go back and survey people, where did you learn this? Where did you read that? They're not aware of it. They say, I got to it through Facebook. And so, we lose something there because the brand recognition isn't as strong as it once was. But far more important, the readers and the community is losing something because they're not understanding the sourcing. They're not understanding where this information came from and why and whether it should be trusted. So I would defend the 27-year-old journalists because we have a lot of them in our newsroom, and they're among the most aggressive and smart reporters that we have. The difference is not generational. The difference is in the intent, whether the intent is to inform the public or fool the public. So if you turn on any of the cable news channels, whatever your ideology, you'll see an enormous difference. Go back and look on YouTube at any of those channels from 10 years ago or 15 years ago. They are elementally different. If you go back 10 or 15 years, you will see reporters going out into the field, interviewing people, looking at documents, using all of the tools of traditional journalism. If you go in any of those channels today, you see big panels of people yammering at each other. That is enormously cheaper to produce. Bring people into a studio, have them talk, yell at each other. Ideally, every bit as many people will watch, and you can do it at a fraction of the cost.
I actually had a producer at a network, not named and not the one I was affiliated with, say to me at one point, to your point, don't put experts in news packages. Experts don't rate. In other words, they don't hold the ratings.
Wow.
Now that was a shocking thing to hear. Don't put an expert in a news story.
And I don't want to be the voice of pessimism here, but I'm going to be, and say that I wish that people were going to these sources looking for informed information. What I found in writing this book, the way people use information resources on the internet is they go there to confirm their confirmation bias. They go there to find stuff they already believe, and they discount the stuff that conflicts with them. And we found this problem you're talking about of, I don't even know how I landed on the story. It's lucky if they land at the Washington Post, because they are just as likely to land at InfoWars, right, or Breitbart, or some
fake news,
or some outlet that's meant, or RT, or one of its many minions. So I'm very concerned about this because people don't discriminate about this, and we're actually finding there are studies that were done that are continuing that find that people, after clicking and blowing through stories and headlines and then kind of quizzed about what they know about the subject, this is going to sound astonishing, but that after spending enough time on the internet clicking through stories, they are actually dumber. I'm not making this up. They're actually dumber when they're finished because they believe they've acquired knowledge they don't have. And the quick example is like, if you tell somebody, go look up stuff about fossil fuels. Well, we know where fossils come from, right? They're dead brontosauruses or whatever they are. And so people say, now I've got it. I understand it. And also I know a lot about dinosaurs. And what it is, they don't know anything, and they're now resistant to learning anything else. They are worse off by having gone to the internet to do this than if they hadn't done anything at all.
How many of you get your news from Facebook?
Twitter? What about Twitter?
How many of you are on the Twitter getting your news? How many of you still pick up a newspaper to read it? Wow.
God bless you.
Okay, subscribe. What about subscribe? Okay, good. What about those of you who watch TV, be it cable or the 3 main networks for your news? PBS. Okay, PBS. Okay. Oh, okay, I like that. Okay, well, okay. Just unscientific. I just wanted to know. Do you believe you're seeing and hearing fake news? Fake, F-A-K-E news. On Facebook? Do you believe you're getting very fake news? That's what the president calls it. Yes. Next question.
Mark, you mentioned that Donald Trump doesn't really ask questions, and I wonder if you can walk us through what a briefing would look like and how he would handle that situation, and then also maybe if the rest of you could chime in on how, if you were the expert in the room, how you would handle someone like Trump, who you had an obligation to provide information to, but who may not be very receptive.
So we'll be leaving now.
In one of our interviews with Trump, this was in June, so it was clear he was going to be the nominee, so there was a very good chance he would become president of the United States. So I said to him, are you preparing, I know you're out there campaigning, but do you have any time, are you preparing to be president? Are you reading, say, biographies of the great presidents? And there was this long pause, and then he said, I've always wanted to read a biography. And he said, but I don't have time. And so I kind of let him sit in the silence, and then he said, I don't really have time to read books. And I said, well, how will you then deal with the kinds of complex issues that come before a president? It has nothing to do with, I'm not questioning your background or knowledge, but this is the nature of the presidency. Things pop up that you just have no background in. How would you want to get up to speed on those kinds of issues? And he said, well, I'll tell you one thing. I'm not going to read any effing memos. And I said, well, what? And he told this whole story about how when some guy from Wall Street came to see him about an investment, some innovative kind of financing in China. And he said, well, I don't know anything about that. And the guy from Wall Street said, no problem. We have a report we've just done. It's 100 pages. I'll just send it right over to you. He said, don't bother. I won't read it. He said, so I said, well, how will you learn about these things? He said, my people will come in, and they can talk to me, and in 20 seconds I'll know.
Well, all right, wait, before you go, okay, I'm going to ask another question, and I want you to raise your hand. Do you want your president to be well-read? Yes. Okay, go ahead.
So, to Mark's point, Donald Trump wrote in one of his books that the day I learned that it was smart to be shallow was a very deep day for me. What he meant by that, normally shallow is not a positive quality, but Trump has a way of saying, I know what the criticism is going to be, and I'm going to turn it around. He was saying, I'm so smart I can absorb complex information, on a single sheet of paper. And so he used the word shallow, which is an awkward word to use in that case. But that's the way he's looking at things. He thinks, I don't need all this information. That's why he said, I'm smarter than the generals. I know more than the generals. He looks, he says, I'm really, really smart, things like that. That's the way he perceives himself. Whether that's correct or not, is for you all or other people to decide. But that's the way he looks at things himself. He sees himself as being very smart, able to absorb information very, very quickly, and knowing better than people who are, to use your phrase, experts.
Could I jump in with just a moment of history? And I know we're going to, but there are a lot of parallels that are made with Ronald Reagan, and that Ronald Reagan was not a deep reader or terribly well read, that Ronald Reagan did not ask questions, was not especially curious, but Ronald Reagan surrounded himself ultimately with some very smart people, and people who had a lot of experience in government. And I think that it may not be a fatal flaw for a president to say, give me memos, I want to hear things quickly. Then it will depend on who that president or any leader surrounds themselves with to be those advisors and to condense, to synthesize the expertise.
So the problem for Trump is that he has surrounded himself oftentimes with people who are, in essence, yes people. a very small circle of people. It might be 5 people, 3 or 4 of them might be family members, and then one other person whose livelihood basically depends on being in sync with Donald Trump. So earlier, actually it was last year, I interviewed a bunch of former chiefs of staff to the presidents, and I asked each of them, Democrat and Republican, what are your concerns about Donald Trump? And whatever party they were with, they were concerned that will he be willing to learn about things and understand that he doesn't know everything? Because no president, no matter how smart they are, could possibly know everything about all the issues that will come to the fore or some crisis that will suddenly pop up. You simply can't. You've got to pick people that you can rely upon. And will he be willing to say, that I might be wrong. Tell me why I'm wrong. Give me the counter argument here, and not live in fear that you'd be fired the next day or that day. So that is something, to your point, that I don't know if that's a distinguishing factor. I did briefly cover Ronald Reagan. I think one of my first assignments as a very young reporter was to interview Ronald Reagan. He was running for president, and I was like 21 years old.
21, not 27.
Give my age away. And I asked him a series of questions, and I was surprised that he had a series of index cards that he basically was reading answers from. But they were consistent. He wasn't just popping off. So from his point of view, he probably thought, well, I'm making sure I've got my points right. To me, as a young reporter, I was surprised that he didn't have the facility to say everything off the top of his head. But he wanted to be consistent. His aides wanted him to be consistent. For Trump, he has a certain viewpoint, and whether he is going to be persuaded by new sets of facts goes back to healthcare. Has he learned that the way he thought things would run are not the case? Is he going to now rely on his instincts? He's going to rely on other people's opinions that maybe you need to change the way you operate? These are factors we're going to look at closely.
I was a political staffer. So I was in that situation. I was a political staffer during a war. I was a personal advisor on foreign and defense affairs to a senior U.S. senator, the late John Hines of Pennsylvania. And there are 2 approaches to this. One is, this, as strange as this may sound, there is a tiny amount of wisdom in what Trump's saying. There are guys, and my boss could be one of them sometimes, where they're starting to ask questions in such depth that you want them to stop. Okay, Saddam Hussein has invaded Kuwait. Well, how many billion cubic, liters of natural gas go from... Wait, stay with me here. This is a bigger issue. And every staffer's had that moment where the boss starts to just drill down, and you almost wish they would just come back with you to the big stuff. Fine. With that said, you asked, how do you do this when the boss doesn't want to hear this stuff? Your client is not just your boss. And I say this in the book repeatedly. The client of every expert, including journalists, including defense guys, our client is society. And we have to serve our client. And the way you serve your client is you tell your boss the truth, even when it hurts. Mm-hmm. And there was I really got along with Senator Hines. I loved the guy. We had a great relationship. But I can tell you that just before the Gulf War, he asked me for my estimate of casualties because he was going to have to vote. This was before the vote in 91. And I gave him an estimate that I thought it turned out, I was pretty much on the ball because of, what I knew about their weaponry and all this kind of wonky expert stuff, right? And he thought, he was really concerned it was going to be higher. And he threw me out of his office in a hail of F-bombs. I mean, that was like, practically followed me out the door like a cloud. Like for the rest of the afternoon, I was like that little Abner guy with the thundercloud over my head. But I had to stick to my guns. And I said, this is my best expert opinion, whether you want it or not. I came out of the office about 4 or 5 o'clock that afternoon, and he was coming out. We had offices across from each other. He was coming out of his, and I went, "Oh, bad timing! Here it comes again," And he said, "All right, I did some checking. I've also asked some other people." That's what a responsible boss does. To say, "All right, I blew up at you. I'm not sure you were right, but I'm going to ask some other." I'm not sure this is what the president would do, but he asked other people. He said, "It sounds like you're in the ballpark. We need to talk about it again." And we had a very productive conversation. But if you're asking how you do it, you just do it. And you just take that risk and you just tell the boss what he needs to hear, because that is the only way you are serving him and the larger client that you serve as an expert.
This is a great conversation. We have like a few minutes, like literally 10 minutes of questions and answers. And what I want to do is get to as many people as we can, shorten the answers if we can, but this has been great. I know, shorten questions and answers, but I want to ask Mark and Michael something really fast. Yes or no? Is Donald Trump the emperor with the new clothes?
Yes or no?
Don't wait for the translation. No.
There's no gray area.
No, well, there is gray area, but in his case, no, he's not. He's
Okay.
what he's always been, and he's what the American people elected. And he is, they elected him to be provocative, to push back against experts and against the system, and the people who supported him have spent 30 years saying over and over again in increasingly loud voices that neither party is listening to them, neither party reflects what's going on in their lives. And they got more and more extreme over those 30 years in who they chose to be the vehicle for that message. And finally they said, you guys aren't listening, this is what we're going to do.
Michael's smiling really hard. Michael.
I agree with Mark. So.
All right, our next question.
I'm wondering whether the media hasn't been a contributing factor to the death of expertise. In the times when we do see experts, particularly on television, they're always dueling experts. You've got the economist who says X and the economist who says not X. You've got the scientist who says climate change is happening, and
they're partisan in a lot of instances.
And so the media feels like, all right, we've done our job because we've represented both viewpoints. But it leads the people to say, these guys don't really know anything. They can't agree on basic ideas of science or economics. So why should we trust these guys that they know anything?
I think there's two parts to that, and I'll be really quick. One is the problem with the media is that there's too much bandwidth and too much airtime, and so all the media becomes segmented into boutique outlets that people can go to and never have to really hear anything they don't want to agree with. Even those debates are really mock debates. I mean, they're almost like set-up debates. I mean, they're about as real as pro wrestling most of the time. But the other problem, and I'm going to say this, and this, in the book, I keep putting the blame back where I think it belongs, on the shoulders of the American public. TV is giving people exactly what they want, which is gladiatorial arguments all day long. They don't, as Frank just pointed out to you guys, producers don't put experts on. We're boring. We're the ones who say, like Mark just said, well, there is a little gray. It is a little more nuanced. People, they're not interested in that. They want Jerry Springer over climate change. And so the networks, driven by what drives us all, turning a profit, right? They give the people exactly what they want. So, yes, the media are responsible, but the public is also demanding it.
And part of the problem is using overly large categories like the media.
Right.
So the media is Breitbart. The media is the Washington Post. The media is your neighbor's Facebook feed, and the media is NBC. I mean, they are completely different animals with completely different values and completely different motivations. And when we lump them together, we're buying into what Newt Gingrich was talking about when I talked to him the other day about the anti-intellectualism of the Trump administration, and his response was, I'm happy being anti-intellectual. And he went and listed a bunch of these big categories, and he said, the academics and the media and the intellectuals in this country, they're all wrong. And that's why we're pushing back against them.
But
when you think in those big categories, it's easy to say they're wrong. When you think about the specific places that you're looking at, you can have a much more nuanced and useful distinction.
But Mark, you know what, I hear you with that, but I think once something crazy, catastrophic happens, that's when there's going to be a rush for the experts, and there's going to be an I told you so moment. And that's the unfortunate piece that I hope never happens.
I'm getting ahead of that I told you so curve.
No, but I'm serious. People are saying, oh, everything's fine. I said, but just if something catastrophic happens, that's when we're going to see the mettle of those in that inner circle and see what happens. And I just hope we never get to that point. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you all for being here today. So I'm like a 23-year-old journalist. I'm not 27 yet, so my apologies. So I wanted to ask, the thing that I really love about being a journalist is that you're seeking the truth, just wherever that truth is, and you don't have a bias, you don't have an ideology that you're carrying into your work. And kind of after the election, I saw so many Facebook posts, be it conservative or liberal, people just making all these hyperbolic statements about kind of the world and affairs. And what I appreciate about journalism is that you just go down the middle, you're just looking for the truth. So maybe just how would you tell people who seem to be so entrenched in their bubbles to come out of their bubble?
Well, if I may, first of all, we've got the conversation about the bubble. The other conversation we have to have is about journalism. because people don't understand what journalism is and how journalism works, and this notion of fake news and alternative facts and all the rest is just now largely confused the public. But we shouldn't be confused. Journalism is about seeking the truth. Journalism is about attribution. All right, it's not just a blind allegation. It's you attribute the allegation to an individual, to a document, to something that you can actually put your hands on. It's about editing. It's about accountability. If you screw up, you get fired. You're not a blogger with no editor. You've got somebody looking over your shoulder asking you why. I used to have it when I was at CNN. I used to have. Anybody remember Maxwell Smart? Get Smart,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
I used to have the cone of silence. I would say as the bureau chief, and I would take a reporter into the cone of silence when they wanted to go on the air with an unnamed source and say, "Who is it?" All right? So there's a process in journalism, all right? And there are consequences for getting it wrong. People get fired if they get it wrong, or if they plagiarize, or anything else. There are no consequences in the world of fake news, or very few that I know about. So I think that's one thing. We're at the Virginia Festival of the Book. So a book that I recommend, all my students read it, and I recommend it to anybody who cares and wants to understand about journalism. It's an easy read. I'm sure everybody here knows it. It's called The Elements of Journalism by Tom Rosenstiel and Bill Kovach. And it's a fabulous book. 11 Principles of Journalism: verification, seek the truth, proportionality, how you put things together. But you're right. The job of the journalist, like the job of a judge, doesn't mean the person might not have an observation or even an opinion about what's going on. But their job is to adjudicate so that both sides, all sides, whatever points of view can be brought, and then let the jury decide.
Can we get fake news out of the way? My background is Russia stuff. Let me tell you what fake news is. Fake news is an intentional lie created out of whole cloth. It is constructed and then disseminated, usually through willing minions on fake websites that have been set up for this goal. It is not spin. It is not bias. It is not a correctable error that is then handled by these kinds of rules of accountability. We have to stop using this term fake news, because fake news increasingly is being used to mean stuff I don't like, and that's certainly the way the president uses it.
That's true.
Fake news is anything that just happens to penetrate that bubble that isn't right. Fake news, to somebody like me who's been studying the Russians for a good part of my career, fake news has a very specific meaning. It is an intentionally constructed falsehood. And I had to kind of get that right out, because we tend to use it, and it's entering the vernacular as just stuff, even spin or bad journalism, shoddy journalism. That's not fake news.
All right. Yes, ma'am. Question.
Question for Michael and Mark. In doing your research about Donald Trump, what was the most surprising thing that you learned about him? Or rather, was there something that you uncovered that completely contrasted with his public persona?
Well, for me, the most surprising thing was the depth of his financial difficulties. We knew that he'd had corporate bankruptcies, but the depth of those were really quite something. We have reporters who look so deeply into the 6 corporate bankruptcies, and it was far worse than you might imagine. Yes, he was able to come out of it, but it took an awful lot of extraordinary measures, and it was a roller coaster ride. He was at one point $900 million in debt. That's an awful lot of debt. He had 6 corporate bankruptcies. I mentioned earlier the one public company that he had, the share price went from $35 to 17 cents, which every time I mention that, people are shocked. Very few people know that story or the full story of what happened in the bankruptcy. So to me, that was the most surprising, partly because it was so bad, and partly because somehow he was able to recover and come back and be successful. And the way he came back was by presenting himself as so successful. He did The Apprentice, the television show, which Mark knows a lot more about than I do, but it was all based on the premise that he was an incredibly successful business person, but without that, he wouldn't have been successful afterwards. And he earned something like, $200 million in revenue personally from that show as a producer and so forth. So that,
and he's still producer of it.
Right. He still is, and also doing branded building. So it's surprising how the depths of how unsuccessful he was, and that he was able to then recover in fairness. And so when I talked about this during the campaign, I said, before you dismiss Donald Trump, realize that he was able to go on this roller coaster ride and yet come back. And if you forget that he came back, you're going to dismiss him too early, and that's why he might be president. Of course he is.
Well, go ahead, Mark.
To me, the most surprising thing was the depth of the narcissism. So I'll give you an example. We were at his office, and before we came in to sit down in his inner office, he said, wait, I want to show you something. He took us across the hall to a conference room, and the only contents of the conference room was a table stacked with magazines, dozens and dozens of magazines, all with himself on the cover. And as he brought us into the room, he said, I want to show you something. I just discovered this. And he brought us in the room, he shows us the magazines, he tells us he's been on the cover of Time more than anyone else in the history of the world, including popes and presidents. And then he says, I just discovered this just appeared here. And I said, well, it's right across from your office. It's 4 feet outside your office. When you just discovered this, and he just kept repeating that. And there were these odd moments again and again where he just couldn't get off it being so much about himself.
Wow. Well, it's 5:15, everyone. I know. This has been an excellent panel discussion. Questions, expertise, and the president, not just for News Junkies. You have a new perspective about questioning, about expertise or lack thereof, and number 45, correct? All right. Well, we want to thank the Virginia Festival of the Book, and also we would like to thank the City of Charlottesville for providing this venue. We're in the City Council chambers, and we cannot end the occasion and in the day without saying thank you to our authors. Frank Sesno, the author of Ask More. Let's give him a big round of applause. Tom Nichols, the author of The Death of Expertise. Michael Kranish, the co-author of Trump Revealed. And Marc Fisher, also the co-author of Trump Revealed. And I'm April Ryan.
April Ryan, the author of At Mama's.
Thanks. All of the authors are here to sign books once we conclude this portion of the event today. We thank you so much. This has been so much fun. I learned something. I'm sure you guys learned something. Get your books, get them signed, and I'm sure they'll answer some questions while signing. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.